When most people think of the story of the Garden of Eden, the image that immediately comes to mind is the serpent, coiled among the branches of the tree, whispering temptation into the ears of Adam and Eve. In the traditional Judeo-Christian interpretation, this serpent is the embodiment of evil, a cunning agent of Satan whose sole purpose is to lead humanity astray. The fruit it offers is forbidden. The act of eating it is framed as the first sin, and from that moment onward, humanity is seen as fallen, cursed, and in need of redemption. It is a narrative that has been told for millennia, ingrained into the very way many societies define morality, obedience, and the nature of evil itself. But what if this perspective has been, at least in part, a misinterpretation? What if the figure we have been taught to fear and revile is not evil at all, but something far more complex, even positive? This is not a small question. It challenges the very moral foundation of one of the most widely known stories in the world, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that good and evil may not be as clear-cut as we have been led to believe. The serpent, in this light, might not be a symbol of deception or malevolence, but instead a bearer of wisdom, a catalyst for awareness, and a guide toward understanding the divine spark within humanity. This alternative view is not a product of modern reinterpretation or creative retelling. It comes from an ancient tradition often marginalized in mainstream religious history: Gnosticism. Gnostics, a diverse set of spiritual movements that emerged in the first few centuries of the Common Era, read the story of Eden very differently. Where Orthodox interpretations see disobedience, Gnostics see awakening. Where mainstream Christianity labels the serpent as a tempter, Gnostics present it as a liberator, revealing knowledge that humanity had been denied. In this video, we are going to take a journey through this lesser-known lens, exploring why the serpent was not evil according to Gnostic thought, and what this reinterpretation can teach us about the nature of knowledge, spiritual freedom, and the way we define morality. We will examine the foundational beliefs of Gnosticism, unpack its radical reading of the Garden of Eden, and explore how this view turns conventional ideas of sin and punishment on their head. By the end, the familiar story of the serpent, Adam and Eve, will look very different, and viewers will be invited to question what they thought they knew about one of the most enduring tales in human history. Gnosticism is not a single religion or dogma, but rather a diverse collection of spiritual movements and ideas that emerged in the early centuries of the Common Era, roughly around the same time as the rise of Christianity. At its heart, Gnosticism is defined by a profound emphasis on knowledge, what the Gnostics called Gnosis. This knowledge is not mere intellectual understanding. It is an experiential, transformative insight into the divine, a recognition of the spark of divinity that resides within each human being, often trapped or obscured by the material world. Gnosis is both awakening and liberation, an intimate understanding that goes beyond belief or faith into direct, personal experience of the truth. Central to Gnostic thought is a dualistic worldview. The universe is divided between the material and the spiritual, the physical and the divine. The material world in this framework is not inherently good. It is flawed, transient, and often deceptive. The Gnostics believed that human beings are trapped in this material plane, bound by ignorance, limitation, and the authority of a lesser, imperfect creator. In contrast, the spiritual world is the realm of the true, higher God, a realm of light, purity, and eternal knowledge. Humanity's ultimate task is to transcend the confines of the material, reconnect with the divine, and awaken to the truth that lies within. Gnosticism also reimagines the concept of salvation. Unlike Orthodox Christianity, which emphasizes faith, obedience, and the redemptive power of Christ's sacrifice, Gnosticism presents salvation as liberation through knowledge. To be saved is to see through the illusion of the material world, to recognize the demiurgic forces that confine and mislead, and to awaken to one's own divine essence. It is a deeply personal and internal process, rather than a system of external rites or moral commandments. Historically, Gnostic ideas arose in a cultural and religious environment that was rich with philosophical debate. They drew from Jewish, Christian, Hellenistic, and even Egyptian thought, weaving together narratives, symbols, and teachings into a complex tapestry of spiritual insight. Early Gnostic communities often produced texts that reinterpreted familiar stories from the Hebrew scriptures and the emerging Christian canon, offering alternative explanations for the creation of the world, the origin of humanity, and the roles of key biblical figures. In these texts, familiar characters are often reframed in ways that challenge conventional moral assumptions, inviting readers to question what they have been taught. One of the most important aspects of Gnosticism is its radical questioning of authority. The Gnostics did not blindly accept the material world, the established religious hierarchy, or the moral frameworks handed down by tradition. Instead, they encouraged direct experience and inner knowing. This subversive approach to spiritual life is why Gnostic texts often present figures like the serpent in Eden not as villains, but as guides and teachers. By emphasizing knowledge over obedience, the Gnostics invert the moral logic of conventional religious storytelling, challenging centuries of assumptions about good, evil, and the nature of human destiny. Gnosticism, therefore, is not merely an obscure historical curiosity. It is a lens that radically transforms the way familiar stories are understood, offering an alternative path to understanding humanity's place in the universe. In the story of Eden, it allows us to ask, what if the serpent was not evil? What if the story we thought we knew was not a warning, but an invitation to awaken? By exploring the Gnostic view, we begin to see that the serpent's role is not to condemn humanity, but to illuminate the path toward knowledge, freedom, and spiritual insight. In Gnostic thought, the creation of the material world is not the work of the ultimate transcendent God, but of a lesser, imperfect entity known as the Demiurge. The term Demiurge comes from the Greek demiurgos, which literally means artisan or craftsman, and it reflects the Gnostic understanding of a creator who is skilled but limited, powerful but ignorant. Unlike the true, higher God, who exists beyond the confines of the material universe and embodies pure light and knowledge, the Demiurge is flawed. In some Gnostic texts, the Demiurge is even portrayed as arrogant, believing itself to be the supreme deity, yet it is blind to the spiritual reality that lies beyond its own creation. The Demiurge is responsible for the physical universe, including the earth, the stars, and humanity's corporeal form. But in the Gnostic framework, this creation is not a perfect paradise. It is a prison, a realm of limitation, suffering, and deception. Material existence, rather than being inherently good or neutral, is seen as a trap that obscures the divine light within each human being. This is why Gnostics often describe the physical world as a shadow of the true spiritual realm, an imitation that can confine and mislead. The Demiurge, as the architect of this flawed reality, is not malicious in a conventional sense, but its ignorance makes it a force that sustains human suffering and spiritual blindness. This understanding flips the conventional moral assumptions of the Genesis story on their head. In Orthodox readings, God creates a perfect world, and any transgression is a moral failing on the part of humans. In the Gnostic reading, however, the world itself is imperfect from its inception, and humanity's so-called disobedience can be reinterpreted as an act of seeking truth within a deceptive system. Humans are not failing in a moral sense. They are attempting to break free from the limitations imposed by the Demiurge, striving to reconnect with the higher, unknowable God beyond the material realm. The distinction between the Demiurge and the true God also shapes the Gnostic perception of morality. If the Demiurge is responsible for the structures, rules, and moral codes of the physical world, then obeying those structures does not necessarily lead to spiritual fulfillment. Instead, the path to enlightenment lies in seeing through the illusions of the material universe, recognizing the false authority of the Demiurge, and cultivating inner knowledge of one's divine origin. In this context, the serpent in Eden becomes a figure of guidance rather than a tempter, offering the knowledge that allows Adam and Eve to perceive the truth beyond the Demiurge's domain. The material world, then, is not inherently evil, but it is limiting, deceptive, and distracting. It can foster ignorance and attachment, keeping humans from realizing their true spiritual nature. The Gnostic perspective sees life in the material world as a test of awareness, a challenge to awaken to the light within. The serpent's role within this framework is not to punish or deceive, but to awaken the divine spark in humanity, providing a glimpse of the higher reality that the Demiurge cannot fully control or comprehend. By framing the universe in this way, Gnosticism offers a radical reinterpretation of everything in Eden. The story is no longer about sin and shame, but about awakening, insight, and the pursuit of knowledge in a world designed to obscure the divine. Understanding the Demiurge and the flawed nature of the material world is essential to seeing why the serpent cannot be labeled evil. It is an agent of enlightenment within a reality that is fundamentally limited, imperfect, and controlled by a being blind to the higher truth. In the Gnostic worldview, the Garden of Eden is not simply a lush paradise created for humanity's enjoyment. Rather, it is a carefully constructed allegory, a symbolic space that represents spiritual ignorance, confinement, and the limitations imposed by the material world. Unlike the traditional Christian perspective, which depicts Eden as the pinnacle of divine creation, Gnosticism frames the garden as a place where humans are initially unaware of their true divine nature, a realm designed more to obscure knowledge than to nurture it. The trees, rivers, and animals are not merely natural features, but symbols of the structures and distractions of the material plane, the very environment in which humanity is kept from recognizing the spark of divinity within themselves. From the Gnostic perspective, Adam and Eve are not simply living in a perfect world before a moral failure. They are ensnared in a system of ignorance. Humanity's innocence in the garden is not a virtue, but a state of unawareness, a condition of being disconnected from the higher spiritual reality. The material world, crafted by the Demiurge, is fundamentally designed to limit perception, to instill obedience to rules that serve the lesser creator rather than to guide humans toward enlightenment. In this sense, Eden is not a paradise in the way most people think of it. It is more like a gilded cage, beautiful and enticing on the surface, yet restrictive in its purpose. The act of eating from the tree, then, is not simply a moral transgression. It is a symbolic awakening. The fruit represents knowledge, insight, and awareness, the very gnosis that allows humanity to perceive the higher divine reality. When Adam and Eve take the fruit, they are not succumbing to sin, but taking a crucial step toward liberation. moving from the passive state of ignorance imposed by the Demiurge into a conscious state of understanding. This act of awakening is central to the Gnostic interpretation because it reframes the narrative. What the Orthodox tradition calls a fall is actually a beginning, the initiation of humanity's journey towards spiritual enlightenment. Eden, as a Gnostic allegory, also emphasizes the duality that runs throughout Gnostic thought. The garden is material, finite, and limited, representing the physical world, whereas the knowledge that the serpent offers points toward the infinite, eternal, and divine realm beyond. This duality underscores the tension in the human experience between the confines of the material and the aspiration to reunite with the higher, unknowable God. Every element of Eden, the prohibition, the trees, the boundaries, is part of a system designed to keep humans aligned with the Demiurge's flawed vision, which makes the serpent's intervention all the more critical. By interpreting Eden this way, the Gnostics encourage a radical rethinking of what it means to be human. The garden is not a reward, it is a starting point, a place where humans are challenged to recognize their entrapment and seek knowledge beyond appearances. The serpent becomes the first teacher, guiding humanity to question the authority of the Demiurge and the value of the material world, and prompting the realization that true life is not measured by obedience, but by the awareness of the divine spark within. In this sense, the Gnostic Eden is not a cautionary tale of disobedience. It is an allegorical roadmap for awakening, one that positions the serpent as a necessary catalyst for human understanding and liberation. In the Gnostic interpretation of Eden, the serpent is not a malevolent trickster or a representation of ultimate evil, but a profound symbol of wisdom, guidance, and liberation. Where mainstream readings cast the serpent as the villain of the story, Gnostics saw it as a bringer of knowledge, a necessary agent who disrupts the imposed ignorance of the material world and opens the door to spiritual awakening. The serpent, in this context, is not working against humanity out of malice, but acting in alignment with the higher divine truth, encouraging Adam and Eve to question the deceptive structures of the world around them. This symbolism is rooted in the broader Gnostic emphasis on knowledge, or Gnosis, as the key to spiritual freedom. The serpent offers insight, not punishment. It provides access to understanding that humanity was previously denied. In Gnostic texts, the serpent's wisdom is often associated with seeing through illusion, recognizing the limitations of the material world and awakening to the presence of the higher God that lies beyond the realm of the Demiurge. By urging Adam and Eve to eat from the tree, the serpent is effectively inviting them to claim their own divine potential, to step out of spiritual ignorance, and to embrace knowledge as the path to liberation. The image of the serpent as a teacher also resonates with symbolic traditions outside of Gnosticism. In many ancient cultures, serpents were associated with transformation, healing, and the cyclical nature of life. Their shedding of skin represents renewal, growth, and the continual process of awakening. Gnosticism absorbs these archetypes, portraying the serpent as a figure of evolution rather than corruption, suggesting that humanity's first act of disobedience was actually the first act of spiritual maturation. It is through this lens that the serpent becomes less a threat and more a necessary companion on the journey toward enlightenment. Furthermore, the serpent's guidance in Eden is intrinsically tied to the recognition of the Demiurge's limitations. By offering knowledge, the serpent disrupts the artificial order established by the Demiurge, allowing Adam and Eve to see beyond the superficial rules and boundaries imposed by the material creator. The act of listening to the serpent is therefore an act of spiritual courage, a deliberate choice to question authority, to seek truth beyond appearances and to reclaim the divine spark that has always been within them. In this sense, the serpent is a liberator, a mentor, and an emblem of the transformative power of knowledge itself. The serpent's role is also deeply intertwined with the concept of awakening in Gnosticism. Knowledge is never passive. It requires engagement, discernment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The serpent's wisdom is challenging because it demands that humanity face the reality of their entrapment and the illusions of the material world. It encourages Adam and Eve to rise above complacency, to refuse blind obedience, and to embrace the transformative discomfort that accompanies true understanding. In doing so, the serpent becomes a catalyst for spiritual evolution, guiding humans toward a realization of their higher nature and their inherent connection to the divine. In essence, the serpent in Gnostic thought is far from evil. It embodies the very principle that Gnosticism values above all else: the pursuit of knowledge, the recognition of one's own divinity, and the courage to awaken from the ignorance imposed by the material world. It is a figure that challenges, instructs, and liberates, turning the conventional story of temptation into a narrative of enlightenment. By understanding the serpent in this light, we begin to see that what mainstream interpretations have long condemned as sin is, in fact, the beginning of spiritual awareness, the first step in humanity's journey back toward the true God. In the Gnostic perspective, the story of Eve and Adam taking the fruit from the tree is not an act of sin, rebellion, or moral failure, but the central moment of awakening, the initiation of humanity into self-knowledge and spiritual understanding. The traditional narrative frames Eve as the first to disobey God, often casting her as a cautionary figure whose actions bring suffering and loss. Gnosticism, however, turns this interpretation completely on its head, presenting Eve as the seeker, the first to grasp the possibility of liberation, and the one who catalyzes a process of enlightenment for all of humanity. Eve's choice to eat the fruit can be understood metaphorically as the deliberate pursuit of knowledge in a world that has been structured to obscure it. In the Gnostic framework, the material world, crafted by the Demiurge, is designed to maintain ignorance and passivity. Adam and Eve's initial state of innocence is, in fact, a condition of unawareness. The fruit offered by the serpent represents Gnosis, the awareness of the divine spark within themselves, the recognition of the higher God beyond the material confines of their world, and the insight that their existence is not defined solely by obedience to the Demiurge. By choosing to eat, Eve exercises agency, curiosity, and discernment, qualities that the Gnostics valued as essential to spiritual awakening. Adam's participation in this act is equally significant. While Eve initiates the process, Adam follows, demonstrating that humanity collectively bears responsibility for seeking knowledge and recognizing the truth of its own divine nature. This moment transforms what the Orthodox tradition calls disobedience into a metaphor for conscious decision-making. The choice to move from ignorance to awareness, from passivity to engagement with the spiritual reality that exists beyond material limitations. In Gnostic thought, humanity's fall is not a moral lapse, but the very beginning of liberation, the point at which individuals begin to awaken to their inherent connection to the divine. The act of taking the fruit, then, becomes a profound symbol of transformation. It represents the moment when humans turn away from blind submission to the Demiurge's laws and toward the pursuit of Gnosis. The Gnostics frame this not as a transgression, but as a courageous and necessary step in the journey toward enlightenment. It embodies the principle that true knowledge is never easy, that spiritual growth requires questioning, discernment, and sometimes defiance of imposed authority. Adam and Eve's choice is, in essence, humanity claiming its own agency and asserting the right to understand, explore, and awaken to its divine potential. Furthermore, the story underscores the Gnostic view that awakening is a process rather than an event. The initial act of eating the fruit opens the door to a deeper journey of understanding, a path that involves recognizing the illusions of the material world, confronting the limitations imposed by the Demiurge, and striving toward reconnection with the higher, unknowable God. The serpent facilitates this awakening, but the responsibility lies with Adam and Eve to act upon the knowledge offered. In this sense, the Garden of Eden narrative becomes less a tale of punishment and more a story of the first steps towards spiritual liberation, with humanity taking responsibility for its own enlightenment. Eve, Adam, and the act of awakening therefore become central symbols in the Gnostic reinterpretation of Eden. They are not cautionary figures warning against curiosity or desire. They are exemplars of the courageous pursuit of knowledge, the recognition of truth in the face of imposed ignorance, and the willingness to embrace the transformative power of enlightenment. By reframing their choices in this way, Gnosticism turns the story of Eden into a narrative of empowerment and spiritual discovery, where what was once condemned as sin is revealed as the essential beginning of human awakening. To fully appreciate the radical nature of the Gnostic interpretation, it is essential to compare it directly with the Orthodox, mainstream Christian narrative of Eden. In the traditional reading, the Garden of Eden is the pinnacle of God's creation, a perfect, idyllic paradise designed for humanity to live in harmony with divine law. The serpent is cast as the embodiment of evil, often associated with Satan, whose only goal is to deceive Adam and Eve into committing the first sin. Eating the fruit represents disobedience, a moral failure, and the moment humanity falls from grace, resulting in punishment, exile, and the need for divine redemption. In this framework, morality is absolute, obedience is virtuous, and deviation from divine law is sinful. Gnosticism, by contrast, flips almost every element of this interpretation on its head. First, the garden itself is no longer an unblemished paradise. It is a symbol of spiritual ignorance and limitation, a controlled environment created by the Demiurge to keep humanity unaware of their divine potential. Where Orthodox Christianity frames Adam and Eve as innocent until they transgress, Gnosticism presents them as trapped in a system designed to obscure knowledge. Their innocence is not virtuous, but indicative of a lack of awareness. This shift fundamentally changes the narrative's moral calculus. In the Gnostic view, there is no original sin in the sense of a moral failure. Instead, the act of eating the fruit is the first conscious step toward enlightenment. The serpent itself exemplifies the divergence between the two perspectives. In Orthodox tradition, the serpent is deceitful, manipulative, and malevolent, a villain whose intervention leads to humanity's downfall. In Gnostic thought, however, the serpent is a guide, a teacher, and an agent of liberation. It represents the acquisition of knowledge, the awakening of the mind, and the recognition of the divine spark within. What mainstream Christianity condemns as temptation, Gnosticism celebrates as an invitation to awaken, to see beyond the limitations of the material world, and to engage in the pursuit of Gnosis. The serpent is therefore transformed from a symbol of evil into a symbol of wisdom, subverting the conventional moral narrative entirely. Furthermore, the understanding of God and divine authority differs drastically between the two interpretations. Orthodox Christianity presents God as a singular, perfect creator whose commands define morality and whose laws are absolute. Disobedience is sin because it violates divine order, and redemption requires submission and faith. Gnosticism, however, introduces a dualistic cosmology where the material world is crafted by the flawed Demiurge, a lesser deity who mistakes itself for the supreme God. True divinity exists beyond the physical universe, and knowledge of this higher reality is the path to liberation. Morality, therefore, is not defined by adherence to the Demiurge's laws, but by the pursuit of understanding and recognition of one's inner divine essence. What appears as disobedience in Orthodox terms is, in Gnostic terms, an essential act of courage, curiosity, and awakening. The contrast also extends to the interpretation of human purpose. In the Orthodox narrative, humans are created to obey, to steward creation, and to live within the parameters set by God, with ultimate fulfillment achieved through redemption and salvation. In Gnosticism, the purpose of humanity is self-realization, spiritual awakening, and the reclamation of the divine spark trapped within the material world. Adam and Eve's act of taking the fruit is not failure, but the first step toward fulfilling this higher purpose. Knowledge, insight, and liberation replace obedience, sin, and punishment as the central themes of the story. By examining these contrasts, it becomes clear that Gnosticism offers not just an alternative interpretation, but a complete reimagining of Eden's narrative. The story shifts from one of fall and condemnation to one of awakening and empowerment. Moral labels like evil are no longer fixed or universal. They are reframed according to the perspective of spiritual insight versus material limitation. In this light, the serpent's role, humanity's choices, and the very meaning of the garden itself are radically transformed, encouraging a reconsideration of conventional assumptions about sin, virtue, and the nature of divine authority. At the heart of Gnosticism lies a radical redefinition of what it means to be human, and central to this redefinition is the concept of Gnosis, knowledge, but not in the intellectual or academic sense familiar to the modern world. Gnosis is intimate, experiential, and transformative. It is the recognition of the divine spark that exists within every person, the awakening to the truth that our existence is not bound by the material limitations of the world, and the realization that a higher, ineffable God exists beyond the flawed creation of the Demiurge. In this framework, liberation is achieved not through obedience, ritual, or faith alone, but through the direct acquisition of knowledge and awareness of one's true nature. The serpent's role in Eden is inseparable from this principle. By offering the fruit of knowledge, the serpent is not tempting Adam and Eve towards sin. It is presenting the first opportunity for Gnosis, the first chance to see beyond the superficial reality of the material world into the spiritual truth that has been hidden. In Gnostic thought, the act of acquiring knowledge is inherently liberating because it disrupts the authority of the Demiurge and allows humans to recognize their divine potential. The serpent is the catalyst, the teacher, and the symbolic embodiment of the principle that knowledge, however challenging or uncomfortable, is the key to spiritual freedom. Gnosis, in this sense, is a profoundly active process. It is not merely knowing facts or stories about the divine, it is awakening the consciousness to perceive the spiritual reality that underlies the physical world. This awakening often comes through questioning, critical reflection, and the courage to confront the illusions imposed by the material realm. For Adam and Eve, eating the fruit symbolizes this active pursuit. It marks the moment when humanity begins to exercise discernment, curiosity, and self-determination, stepping beyond passive acceptance of the Demiurge's authority into a conscious engagement with the divine. The transformative power of Gnosis is also tied to the Gnostic understanding of duality. Humanity exists in a material world that is incomplete, imperfect, and sometimes deceptive, yet within each person resides a spark of the divine, a connection to the higher God that transcends space, time, and physicality. Knowledge allows humans to awaken to this dual reality, to perceive the world for what it is, and to realign their lives towards spiritual liberation. The serpent's guidance, therefore, is not just an isolated act within Eden. It is emblematic of the entire Gnostic path, in which awakening and understanding are the essential means of escaping ignorance, limitation, and suffering. This emphasis on knowledge also reframes the moral landscape of the story. Where Orthodox interpretations define sin and obedience in absolute terms, Gnosticism places value on insight and discernment. Actions are judged not by adherence to external law, but by their capacity to illuminate the truth and facilitate awakening. The serpent's gift of knowledge, and Adam and Eve's choice to accept it, become a positive, liberating moment, representing the first conscious step in humanity's journey towards spiritual autonomy. In other words, Gnosis is the doorway through which humanity moves from entrapment in a flawed material world to the recognition of the eternal, ineffable, divine reality. By focusing on Gnosis as the path to liberation, Gnosticism presents a worldview in which the acquisition of knowledge, awareness of one's inner divinity, and courage to challenge imposed ignorance are the ultimate spiritual virtues. The serpent, therefore, is not evil, but essential. It embodies the principle that enlightenment begins with understanding, that freedom begins with knowledge, and that true salvation is not found in blind obedience, but in the awakening of the soul to its inherent divine potential. Eden, the serpent, and the act of eating the fruit are all intertwined in a symbolic narrative that celebrates curiosity, discernment, and the transformative power of knowledge. The Gnostic reinterpretation of the serpent has had a surprisingly enduring impact, resonating far beyond the early centuries in which Gnosticism flourished. While mainstream Christianity marginalized Gnostic texts and teachings, branding them as heretical, the symbolic power of the serpent persisted in mystical, esoteric, and philosophical traditions. Across time, the serpent became more than just a character in a story. It evolved into a symbol of wisdom, transformation, and the courage to question established authority. This legacy can be traced through various movements that embrace the idea that knowledge, rather than blind obedience, is the key to spiritual liberation. In many mystical and esoteric traditions, the serpent is celebrated as a figure of awakening and insight. For instance, in alchemical writings, serpents often represent transformation and the cyclical nature of spiritual growth, shedding their old skin to reveal renewal and enlightenment. Similarly, in Kabbalistic and Hermetic traditions, the serpent appears as a guide, an emblem of hidden knowledge that must be sought and understood. These reinterpretations echo the Gnostic emphasis on Gnosis and suggest that the story of Eden, when read through a lens of knowledge rather than morality, becomes a template for human spiritual development. The serpent's wisdom, once condemned, is now understood as an essential tool for perceiving deeper truths. The Gnostic serpent also continues to challenge conventional moral binaries. By positioning the serpent as a liberator rather than a villain, Gnosticism destabilizes the simplistic dichotomy of good and evil. It prompts readers to question who defines morality, whether rules imposed by authority figures necessarily serve human well-being, and what true sin might be in a universe where ignorance itself is the real limitation. This symbolic challenge has influenced a wide range of thinkers, writers, and spiritual seekers who seek to transcend rigid moral structures and explore the nature of knowledge, freedom, and self-realization. The serpent, in this sense, is not just a character in a story, but a perennial archetype of awakening, inquiry, and transformation. Moreover, the Gnostic interpretation of the serpent serves as a reminder of the transformative potential of reframing familiar narratives. By seeing the serpent as a teacher rather than a tempter, one begins to recognize that seemingly negative experiences or challenges can catalyze growth, understanding, and liberation. The Eden story, from this perspective, is less about failure and punishment, and more about the journey of consciousness, the unfolding of insight, and the awakening of humanity to its own divine potential. This legacy has informed modern spiritual and philosophical movements that prioritize personal insight, inner freedom, and the pursuit of truth over adherence to imposed dogma. The enduring appeal of the Gnostic serpent also lies in its subversive nature. It invites us to look critically at inherited narratives, to question authority, and to embrace knowledge even when it challenges comfort, tradition, or established morality. In doing so, it provides a model for spiritual courage, demonstrating that liberation often comes from stepping beyond the boundaries of conventional thought. This is why the serpent continues to resonate with those seeking alternative paths to understanding, enlightenment, and empowerment. It is a symbol not only of wisdom, but of rebellion against ignorance, an enduring reminder that the pursuit of truth often requires questioning the very foundations upon which we have been taught to rely. In short, the legacy of the Gnostic serpent is one of empowerment, insight, and transformation. Far from being evil, it is a guide for awakening, a reminder that knowledge can liberate, and a challenge to rethink what it truly means to be human in a world shaped by imperfect forces. Its influence persists across time, inspiring seekers, mystics, and thinkers to see beyond conventional morality, to embrace Gnosis, and to understand that enlightenment is both a journey and a destination, initiated by curiosity, guided by wisdom, and embodied in the courage to awaken. When we step back and consider the Gnostic interpretation of the Eden story in its entirety, we are confronted with a strikingly different moral landscape from the one most people have been taught. The serpent, traditionally condemned as the embodiment of evil, emerges instead as an agent of enlightenment, a teacher, and a symbol of the transformative power of knowledge. Adam and Eve, far from being merely disobedient, become active participants in their own spiritual awakening, taking the first steps toward recognizing the divine spark that resides within them. The Garden of Eden, once seen as an idyllic paradise lost through human error, is reframed as a realm of limitation and ignorance, a place where awakening becomes necessary and courageous, not sinful. In this light, the concepts of good and evil are no longer fixed absolutes dictated by obedience to an external authority. Instead, morality is measured by the pursuit of knowledge, the recognition of spiritual truth, and the courage to awaken from the illusions of the material world. What Orthodox traditions frame as evil or sin may, in fact, be acts of insight, growth, and liberation. Conversely, blind adherence to imposed laws and acceptance of the material world's limitations may be the true impediments to spiritual fulfillment. The Gnostic lens encourages us to question assumptions, challenge inherited definitions, and recognize that awakening often requires confronting what we have been taught to fear or condemn. The story of the serpent in Eden when understood in this way, becomes far more than a religious myth. It becomes a guide for understanding the human condition, the nature of knowledge, and the process of spiritual liberation. It emphasizes that awakening is an active pursuit, that courage lies in seeking truth, even in the face of uncertainty, and that the divine is not something imposed from outside, but something that can be realized within. By embracing the Gnostic perspective, we are invited to reconsider not only this ancient story, but also the broader assumptions about morality, authority, and the path to spiritual insight. Ultimately, the Gnostic view reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and self-realization is inherently valuable. The serpent is not a villain to be feared, but a teacher to be understood. Adam and Eve are not sinners, but pioneers in the journey toward enlightenment. And the garden is not a lost paradise, but a starting point from which the human spirit can awaken. Rethinking good and evil through this lens challenges conventional moral binaries and encourages a deeper, more nuanced understanding of human potential, freedom, and the transformative power of knowledge. In embracing this perspective, we begin to see that what we have often been taught to fear, the serpent, the fruit, the act of questioning, is precisely what may guide us toward liberation. The Gnostic interpretation of Eden does not diminish the story's depth. It enriches it, turning a tale of fall and punishment into one of awakening, empowerment, and the enduring human quest for divine understanding. The serpent, in this light, is not evil. It is wisdom itself, waiting to guide those who are willing to seek it.